Chapter 49. Sully stumbled into barely controlled chaos on the bridge of the HMS Vercingetorix. Alarms and screeching sirens worked furiously with bright flashing lights to upend the retired Commodore's balance. "You cannot be serious," the captain was shouting at Mr. Blue. "What other option presents itself at the moment? Can you riddle me that, The ship lurched uneasily downward as Ruckus, now occupying Sam Rand's piloting chair, barely scraped under the enormous gold spear. It continued rocketing toward Earth, unimpeded. "A full complement emergency detachment has never even been tried at this speed," Navigator Denry urged. Mr. Blue pressed a switch. The emergency detachment had begun. "What the bloody hell is going on?" Sully swerved over to the time traveler. "The HMS Vercingetorix is about to be split in two. All non-essential personnel are being evacuated into a large portion, and it's being rocketed back to Earth following that giant, javelin." The tipsy Commodore struggled to stand straight between Mr. Blue and Ruckus, whom occupied the pilot and navigator stations. "I'm presuming, then, that we won't be going back to Earth?" "Not at the moment, no. Welcome to the essential personnel." The Time Lord keyed in a series of complicated patterns, and the bridge they occupied suddenly detached. There was a brief vacuum of silence. Sully stared out at the massive viewing window to see the rest of the HMS Vercingetorix float behind them for a second before enormous engines exploded with nuclear fury, blasting the massive spaceship back to Earth, following the massive golden space spear. On board the detachment was the captain, Dr. Jones, pilot Sam Rand, Navigator Denry, and the unexpected guest, Mr. Blue, Sully Brontworth, and the unknown artificial entity called Ruckus. Mr. Blue nodded ahead toward the dark sphere, the home of the Gold Rapids, and origin of the bizarre attack on Earth. "That is where we're headed." "Should I even bother asking why with you?" "Are you drunk?" "No, I'm just a bit hungover." "Do you remember how to sit?" "Oh, give me a..." "Perhaps operate a safety harness?" "Oi, don't patronize me, you horse's ass." Mr. Blue grinned. "Goes for the lot of you. You may want to strap yourself in good and tight." "We're going in hard, then?" "Hard and fast," Sully laughed. "As opposed to what? Soft and slow?" The Time Lord opened his mouth, then closed it and shook his head. Mr. Blue and Ruckus simultaneously input complicated coordinates, jarring the small bridge pod forward violently. Inside, the reverberation of the intense emergency engines, they almost shook Sully's teeth loose. The captain and Dr. Jones gripped each other tightly as pilot Sam Rand struggled with a fold-down seat and Navigator Denry strapped in. The sound of debris outside, tiny flotsam and jetsam of space, collided with the hull at speeds which made every minuscule collision reverberate with the sound of a shotgun. The detached bridge pod blasted forward with incredible force, straining and popping the Durasteel infrastructure as all inside were forced back into their seats with unknown G-forces. Outside the view screen was the small ebony dwarf star, the Gold Rapids base. The dwarf sphere was growing in size steadily as alarms and even more chaos of light heightened the intense speed and sense of impending impact. Sully heard a familiar sound. He noticed it with his mouth. It was shouting, yelling. The bridge pod heaved and strained. It shook with such violence that it seemed the crew inside was riding an earthquake. Sully heard a massive explosion. The air was torn from his lungs. All was darkness. The sensation was relaxing, calming, gave him a bit of a gooseflesh. Sully sighed and smiled, despite himself, with his eyes closed. He could lay here forever, letting that gentle touch massage his... Sully opened his eyes. He saw Navigator Denry's chubby face floating above him, smiling. The retired Commodore sat up straight, looking over at the husky navigator, then around at the shambles of the bridge. "Was my head on your lap, old boy?" Bewildered, Sully demanded. Navigator Denry nodded. Your friend said you needed a cranial massage to promote. Oh, for God's sake! The retired Commodore stood, immediately hearing Mr. Blue's distinct cackle. Sully leered at the Time Lord. Really? Really? You couldn't have set me up with a cutie Samran? Had her run her fingers through my hair? What hair? Mr. Blue laughed. Excuse me. Oi, you black-nailed blonde ponce, I don't... Excuse me, Dr. Jones shouted. Mr. Blue, Sully, and Ruckus turned to face her. Thank you, darling. The captain warily looked at his derelict crew. So, congratulations. You've managed to place the entire complement of the HMS Vercingetorix in mortal danger by jettisoning them, following a gigantic space weapon of some kind, back to planet Earth, which is, by the way, being evacuated. The Time Lord coughed and dusted off his azure tie. Least of all, of course, is the fact that you managed to maroon us here, on this desolate rock, which happens to be the home of our aggressor. The captain ended his tirade on a shout. Hey, at least I got us here safely. Mr. Blue smiled. Sure, right, thanks for that. The Time Lord brushed past the furious captain and his skeleton crew. Ah, well, you men, if you're compiling a list of reasons to hate me, you may as well add them too. What? Who? Mr. Blue kicked open the steel emergency hatch of the bridge pod. The surface of the dwarf sphere planet was dark gray rock with endless mountains of craggy stone. Overhead was a flurrying atmospheric electrical storm, lightning everywhere, no thunder. Awaiting the crew outside, lined up in rows and columns of hundreds of thousands deep, standing motionless, reflective, shimmering, gold, humanoid forms, an entire golden army, standing, watching, waiting.